In the course of any day, I get a lot of information in my inbox, including studies and reports and data and newsletters and so on. A couple caught my eye that I thought you might be interested in, and one is from S&P Global about China's automotive industry and spreading into the global south, and the second is about from the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab about China's clean tech investments, which the automotive industry is an important part of that. So I've got summarized it into 10 points, and I will be as brief as I can. The first one, China's auto export surge is defining global industrial force. So in 2020, not that long ago, China exported 1 million automobiles. Well, last year it was six. And last year there were 88 million automobiles sold worldwide. And China, I think, if I remember correctly, their domestic market accounts for about 27 million of them. So China has become a major player. It's basically taking over the global auto industry, and the Western manufacturers are being squeezed more and more into their traditional markets in Europe but particularly in North America. And EVs now represent 35% of total auto exports, which really are reshaping, global markets. And should note also in 2025, new energy vehicles. So that's what China calls any kind of a vehicle that's got a plug on it. They're up 74% year over year in the first half of the year alone. Okay, number two. The export boom is driven by structural advantages, not just low labor costs. In fact, if some of these factories where they're in China, where they're manufacturing automobiles, they call them dark factories because they turn off the lights as everything is done by robots. Humans don't go in unless there's some kind of an emergency that requires their intervention. Otherwise, the robots are quite happy assembling cars in the dark. They don't need light. So I don't think here in the West that we have quite caught up with the fact that Chinese industry and its innovation ecosystem and on has changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. And in many cases is now superior to what we have, and that is a clarion call to pull up our socks and become more competitive. So let me give you some of the numbers. The Chinese industry itself domestically can manufacture 50 million units. That's 55% of global demand in one country. They don't use it all. They use about half of it, but that gives you an idea. And this is interesting because there was a debate over capacity. The West is accusing China of building too much capacity and then basically dumping, cheap automobiles in global South markets. And what China said, and I think this is a real peek into their strategy, they say it's not overcapacity. We build in advance of demand. It's very different than what we do here in the West. We wait for demand and then we build to meet demand. So a little insight there. Deep domestic supply chains in batteries, electronics, and software. This is a really key thing because China has been, since the 80s and 90s, we've been offshoring industry in North America over to China, and they have developed really deep supply chain to serve the electronics industry, whether it's iPhones, whether it's, TVs, whatever it is. It probably gets manufactured in China, and now they have those supply chains, and they just pivoted over to automobiles, particularly new energy vehicles. And now they have a lot of capacity, and they've driven their costs down. So it makes, they're not only are their EVs and their cars cheaper, they're also better, and they have a lot more features than we're accustomed to here in Canada. State-backed logistics. And I know there's going to be, people are complaining. It's probably some of the folks in the audience today are saying, well, yeah, but it's not fair. Well, you know what? The Americans did this for years, only they did it through ARPA and DARPA and other programs. They didn't come right out and subsidize things. They would do it through the military. They would do it through an aid program. They would do, but they subsidized as well. And what China has done is just flat out chosen industrial policy where they have programs and they subsidize their manufacturers and their supply chains and their R&D and on and on. And that includes roll on, roll off fleets. This is interesting. I didn't realize this, but the government is subsidizing those big, auto carriers, the ships, and they just roll them on, and then and the companies own them, or maybe they lease them if the state's involved, or maybe they get loans. Whatever. The state's involved in that, and that cuts export costs. That's the whole point. Uh, China's industrial learning rates. Now, this is an interesting piece. It comes out of what's called Wright's Law. So, Jim Wright used to be a McConnell Douglas engineer in the U.S. in 1930s. He noticed that in their airplane factory, every time they doubled production, their labor costs fell by about 15 or 20%. And then over it, so it became known as Wright's Law. You double production, you get lower costs. And then over the years, that's been codified and researched, and now it's called learning effects. So you can see it with all of the clean tech, whether it's solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, whatever. As production goes up, costs come down on a curve. So, and China's are steeper and than ours are. Okay, here's a big one, and this is, I think, really important to understand because, again, it gets back to oil demand, which is very important to Canada. Remember, we're the fourth largest oil producer in the world, but we are expecting that the global south will stick with internal combustion engine cars, and the demand there will grow while demand slowly declines in North America and in Europe, Australia, places like that. And that's not what's happening because what China is doing is not only is it exporting, but now it's starting to set up overseas manufacturing. So you see, plants. I mean, BYD is the big manufacturer, EV manufacturer, and you see them. They're all over Europe. They're all over parts of Asia, setting up plants, and even in Latin America. The third member of our Energy Media team, MC Bredner, is moving to Brazil. Has moved to Brazil and her father-in-law bought a BYD car. It was a great car, and for about 15, $20,000. So this is a big that, and it's probably if it's not built in Brazil today, it soon will be because BYD is building a big plant there, and this is part of the industrial strategy of China. It's not just about export now. It's about Chinese companies building plants in other countries, in large part to get behind tariffs, because thanks to Donald Trump. Okay. Number four, ASEAN. So basically the Southeast Asia, and they're starting to move some of their supply chains out of China into places like Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, in order again to get around tariffs. And those countries now offer some of the same advantages that China offered 40, 50 years ago in terms of low labor costs and so on. So they're moving those kinds of industries out into those areas. And they're already, I mean, BYD and the state-owned SAIC, I mean, they just dominate those markets in terms of autos and particularly the fact that their EVs take up a big percentage of auto sales. Okay, number five. MENA, the Middle East, North Africa, has emerged as a new frontier for EV and battery investment. Last year, 20% of all new Chinese clean tech foreign direct investment, sorry, went to there. It was $50 billion worth. And places that you would not normally think of, like Morocco and Egypt, are now emerging as like EV assembly and battery, parts of the battery chain. And they're using their relationship with China to industrialize and sort of leveraging their domestic market. Well, you want to sell cars here. Now we need plants and we need R&D and whatever, and China is accommodating them. And according to the reports I mentioned, proximity to Europe is a big deal for the Middle East, North Africa, because it's not that far. So you should keep your shipping costs down. Okay, so now we're going to go into point number six. The Global South receives 75% of new Chinese manufacturing projects. Now, this is really important. I remember back in May of 2024, and then President Joe Biden was concerned about Chinese EVs coming into North America, into the United States. And so he said, okay, we're going to put a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. And there was a security issue as well. Because Chinese cars come with cameras, and it would be very easy. It was the thinking went, to be able to take data collected in the United States and send it back to China, where it could be used for, diplomatic, military purposes, whatever. But the point was that I made back then was that yes, Biden would keep the Chinese out of the United States market, but all China would do would just pivot global south, and that's exactly what they've done. I mean, they were already there, but now they're ramping it up in a very big way. Latin America, Africa, South Asia, Central Asia increasingly have Chinese EV plants, and China's getting more sophisticated because sometimes they'll pair exports with charging corridors, battery recycling, and local R&D. They call it industrial diplomacy. And they've had the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, for 20, 25 years, where, they will finance, they'll lend money, or they'll invest in infrastructure in the third world, in emerging economies. And so now they've changed that. They've become much more strategic, and they're using the Belt and Road Initiatives to leverage in clean tech and manufacturing, and in particular, the biggest one of the would be EVs. Number seven, automakers are adopting a new light asset global model. So it's not just about, can I export out of China, and it's not about, can my Chinese company, build a plant in Brazil. It's, what about if I license to manufacturers? What about if I do contract manufacturing and OEM partnerships? And there was a Chinese company that contracted with a Canadian company, Magna International. I mean, it's our biggest auto parts manufacturer. And they set up a factory in Austria, of all places, to serve the European market. And so Magna will be manufacturing Chinese EVs under contract in Austria for the European market. I mean, this is how the market is, how the industry is changing so rapidly. And so all of this licensing of technologies gets around U.S. sanctions, is a part of China extending its geopolitical influence, and accelerates their automobiles and their technology getting into local markets. They're building relationships and learning how to operate in markets that they hadn't normally been in, or not much in. Okay, number eight, tariff battles. I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump's tariffs have had many, 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 many unintended consequences, and this would be one of them. And I'm going to do a piece here in the next little while. I'm not sure if it's a column or a Substack essay, uh, but the point is, Trump and the United States were basically absent from COP30 in Brazil over the last couple of weeks. And so what China did is said, power vacuum. All right. If the United States isn't here, can we take advantage of that? And so they had this great big pavilion, and they brought all their manufacturers, like their automakers, and they basically turned it into a trade conference. So, these countries, the emerging economies and the lower income countries would come and say, look, I mean, we want to decarbonize to meet our climate. We need the clean tech. We need electric vehicles and heat pumps and all of these things and China said, we'll be happy to sell you, and we'll be happy to finance them for you through the Belt and Road Initiative. And so the China made out like a bandit at the COP30 conference by selling, building relationships and making agreements with countries to take Chinese automakers, the EV makers. Bad decision on behalf of the Americans, but hardly the first one. Um, so the fact that China is avoiding Canada, and by the way, you'll remember that back in 2024 we followed the Americans, and in September we put on 100% Chinese EV. So we're one of the few markets that has no Chinese EVs at all. And so when you talk to Canadians, they go, well, the transition to EVs is kind of slow. It's just, they're not remaking the world. They're not how are they going to have an impact? How are they going to electrify the transportation sector? They look around and go, well, maybe they're selling EVs in our market is maybe 10, 15% a year of new sales. That's it. Well, folks, it's not happening here. It's happening in Europe, and it's happening, in the global south. That's where all the places we thought we were going to sell oil and gas in a big way are now electrifying with the help of the Chinese. Okay. Point numbers 9 and 10, and then we'll be done. Uh, what's really interesting here is the way the Chinese EV industry has evolved. Because what the Chinese do, everybody backs a company. So you have the national government, which is providing all sorts of support, maybe 15 years ago, to these companies that wanted to get into EV manufacturing. And then you had this provincial governments, because they want to attract investment and create jobs. And then you have the local municipal governments who will bankroll companies as well. And at the beginning of the boom, there were 700 EV companies. This is insane. Now there's about last year I think there were about 100, and the betting was that probably by the time the winnowing process was done, and a bunch of them got bankrupt or been amalgamated with other companies, there would be about 12. Well, that's a lot in one country. But they've emerged there's a number of them emerged as national champions, kind of like the big three in North America, Ford, GM, and Chrysler back in the day before it became Stellantis. Now it's BYD, SIC, Geely, Changan, Chery, on and on, NIO, Xiaomi, an iPhone company, on and on and on. And then, of course, they've got other supply chain companies that are, industrial giants like CATL, the biggest battery company in the world. Or I'll get this one wrong, but Haoyao, Cobalt, which is a huge mining company. So the point is here that China has scaled up to global scale, and they are aggressive, and they work hard, and they bring prices down, and they are moving all of that into the global south in a way we had not imagined even 2, 3 years ago. The final point here, number 10. The broader effect is a remaking of global auto and energy industrial geography. And we know that. I mean, look at the G7, look at the G20. So you've got European countries, you've got the United States, of course, at the top of the pecking order, and then you've got Canada, which is an industrial nation. You've got Korea, you've got Japan, you've got Australia, New Zealand, I guess. But the point here is that all of those countries that have been developed and were industrialized, well, now our dominance in those areas is being seriously challenged. And it's not just that the Chinese are picking up the growth, of new automobile sales in the global south, for example. They're coming for our core markets. And we need to have a response to that. And whatever that response is, first of all, we need to recognize that there's a challenge. And I think the other 9 points that I talked about gave you a really good idea of just how fast the Chinese developed their automobile industry and their EV industry, and how fast it's changing now. Part of it is because the government sees clean energy tech and EVs as part of its industrial diplomacy. So it's a tool of geopolitical influence as well. But boy, I'll tell you, we need to begin to understand the role that China is playing in the industrial economy, and in particular in the automotive industry, because we're about to see many of our familiar brands get their butts kicked. We might see some bankruptcies. We'll certainly see some amalgamations, some mergers, amongst the familiar players that we thought would be here forever, but they've been disrupted. So I think we're going to do this on a regular basis. There'll be various stories, issues, where 10 or 15 minutes of 10 key points and that you can take home with you would be useful. So watch for that, and we'll do more of these. And in fact, in the comments, you might want to suggest other stories and topics for which you'd like to see me do a 10-point explanation on video. So please do. And oh, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that little bell button.